Hello and welcome to the podcast Law for the Lay, a new game to play. I'm your host Clarissa. I'm an Australian lawyer living in the UK and taking on the entertaining challenge with guests on this show to make sense of all the laws that apply to us here on planet Earth as we navigate this game of life. Today's guest is Daniel Martinez. Daniel is a gun criminal defense lawyer and amateur fighter in Palm Bay, Florida, United States, who caught my eye as the fight lawyer on Instagram. His firm, Martinez Law, covers a wide range of areas in lawland, but his true passion is trial advocacy on behalf of the common individual, otherwise known as laypeople. When we recorded this episode, I was lucky enough to get a virtual tour of his office that joins onto his own boxing ring and gym facility that he opens up for members of his community to use. It was genuinely cool. There's no denying Daniel is a bit of a badass, isn't shy of a tattoo or speaking his mind, but deep down, I think he's a bit of a softie, which truly makes him the best combination of a lawyer. He fights like hell on the streets, but fundamentally is a family man and a great friend to many in his local community. I'm so glad I discovered him on this Law for the Lay journey. Now, the first rule about Fight Club may be not to talk about Fight Club, but you can talk about this podcast with anyone, so feel free to share it amongst your communities. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy my chat with Daniel as we discuss the human body as a weapon. Hello, Daniel. Thank you so much for joining us here on Law for the Lay.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Jumping straight into the ring, what's something silly that you love?
Something silly that I love. Wow, I like comedy. I'm a big fan of stand-up comedy, and I'm a sucker for dark humor. Like really, the darker the humor, the better.
Such a standard lawyer. I love it. Is there a particular comedian that's your favorite?
I'm glad you asked that. Yes, Anthony Jeselnik. Have you ever heard of him?
No. I'm going to look him up though.
Please do if you get a chance. He's really good at the roasts. You know, the Comedy Central roasts where they like kind of they roast each other. He's very good, but he's super dark. I mean, you have to be a special kind of individual to enjoy it. I don't know what that says about me. But...
Look, it might be right up my alley. One of my favorite comedians is Jim Jeffries, but he's not exactly the most socially appropriate at all dinner parties. So, yeah. But I think he's residing in the US now.
Yeah, New York.
Uh-huh. Yes, he is.
He is.
So jumping on to the other end of things, on the legal side of life, I reached out to you because you're both a defense attorney and an amateur fighter, and you live in the country where it basically has so many amazing fighters historically. We've got like Mike Tyson, Muhammad Ali, John Jones is an MMA fighter. All of these people come from your country. So I thought you were the best possible person to speak to this topic area. But just for the benefit of my audience, I'll explain to them the backstory to why I reached out to you. So when I was at university, I was pouring beers at the University of Wollongong, the North Gong Hotel. So it was basically the hotspot for university for me and my friends. And I made friends with a lady who was basically the same size as me, but she was a cage fighter. And I joked to her and was just like, oh, I'd really hate to pick a fight with you on a dance floor. Your right hook could really take me out. And she said, I'm actually not allowed to fight with anyone publicly. If I do, I'm going to be dealt with more harshly by a court of law. So that essentially just got me thinking over years and being like, is the human body a weapon? And like, how does that, carry if you're a professional athlete and things like that? So in the context of the US laws, how is the human body seen in a court of law, and can it be a human weapon?
That's a very good question, Clarissa. And I want to be very clear that in the United States, every state has its own, in the criminal justice system, every state has its own laws. I'm in the state of Florida. However, this area of law is pretty consistent throughout the country. We have 50 states here, and every state, although there is a federal law, that's its own sort of animal, but each state handles its own criminal justice issues. In the state of Florida and most states, while there is not, that's a great question, as far as a body as a weapon. If you're a professional fighter, your hands, they call it being licensed. Have you ever heard that expression?
No, what's that mean?
Basically, that means, okay, so if somebody is a professional fighter, if you're an amateur, it's not applicable. But if you're a professional fighter, then you have to have a license to be a professional fighter. You have to apply to that local board, and it'll be the commission. So in Florida, where I live, there is the Florida Boxing Commission, and they have records of you being licensed as a professional fighter. Now, while the law does not discern between fighters, on its face, the law does not discern between fighters and non-fighters. That's sort of a old wives' tale. It does treat you differently because the state and the police have discretion. So let me give you an example. There's different levels of batteries. A battery is an unlawful touching. Do you have the expression battery in the UK or in Australia?
It's sort of thrown around colloquially, but I think it's assault.
Okay, perfect. In America, there is assault, but assault means that's a threat of harm. So an assault would be, Clarissa, if I get close to you and I get into your face and I say, I'm going to hurt you, and I make an action that leads you to believe that I'm going to hurt you. So I take a step forward, I lunge at you, I go like this, right? That's an assault in this country. Now, if I reach the level where I touch you, where I hit you, that's a battery. But there's different levels, and there's what's called aggravated battery, which is considered to be a lot more serious.
Hey listeners, just jumping in quickly here to clarify that in both the UK and Australia, assault can include battery as well. I didn't know much about it given the terminology battery is often included under the umbrella term assault in these jurisdictions, and I'm not a criminal lawyer that specialises in this area with a full understanding of how it works. Legit, the last time I saw a textbook on this was back in 2012, so didn't want to lead you astray on that one by assuming it wasn't an official legal term, because it is. Okay, back to Daniel.
In my experience and in my view, if you're a professional fighter and if let's say me as an amateur hit somebody, I may be charged with simple battery, whereas a professional fighter might be charged with aggravated battery. So the law does, while it's not on paper saying, hey, if you're a professional fighter, automatically you're dealt with more severely, that still tends to be the case in application.
So if you had two people, one was like a non-fighter and the other one was a professional fighter, and they got in a fight, it would seem more aggravated for the person who is the professional fighter because they have a higher level of skill.
Correct. And because the state attorney or the prosecutors, if you will, I don't know if you call them prosecutors where you're from, but the prosecuting attorney will look at all the facts and may say, okay, this defendant is going to be treated more severely because they have the ability to cause more damage because, as you said, they're more skilled. But secondly, they should know better, right? If you're a professional fighter, you know what you're capable of. And so you should not be utilizing that to hurt average lay people, as you call them.
Yeah, absolutely. So is it like in your career, have you ever come across people who are professional fighters and they feel like they've been picked on because someone might see them as a good target to have a biff on with and want to size them up in a bar or something?
Certainly, because when people tend to, especially in America with social media and so forth and so on, people do not see boundaries anymore. So if people see a celebrity or a fighter or an athlete at a bar, for example, or at a nightclub, instead of just waving, hey, what's up, Mr. John Jones? Hey, John, people will heckle them. They think that there's no longer boundaries. So, hey, because I see you on Facebook and Instagram, because I can comment on your Twitter feed, and because you may comment on my Twitter feed, now I feel that I could come up to you and disrespect you. And so it must be very difficult as a professional athlete because that happens all the time. I mean, if you just look up videos on YouTube, if you just put, heckling NBA fans, like in basketball or even football, you're a football fan, I'm sure, in being in the UK, there was a major problem many years ago until I think it was Thatcher. I think Margaret Thatcher created some laws that prevented that from happening. But even in the UK, that was very common for people to go up to soccer players or football players and heckle them, disrespect them, and sort of goad them into a fight, which is true. It's not fair. If you're a professional fighter, it's not fair for people to test you, if you will, to come up to you and, hey, let's try to give this guy a hard time and see if he'll react. Because in the aggregate, if it happens to you every day, could you imagine how much more frustrating that would be?
Yeah, and quite like if you're having it every single day and you're trying to separate the difference between your training and also just everyday life. If you're in the grocery store and someone starts heckling you, I mean, even a sane person would get
Sure.
annoyed with that, let alone someone who's a professional fighter.
Right, and it tends to be very aggressive when it's fighters, because people think, okay, this person is a fighter, so I'm allowed to raise the level of how much I heckle them, if you will.
In terms of like if someone was to get in this situation as a professional fighter, someone heckles them, is the court likely, obviously it's all based on evidence and what arguments each side has, but is the court likely to, although there may be aggravating circumstances, is there a higher chance of self-defense being used in that situation, based on precedent and things like that?
For self-defense purposes, they do look at the relative size and ability of the parties. So if I am a smaller person, if me and a much larger man get into a fight, then the evidence would dictate, or the argument would be, that I had to use self defense, or that I was entitled to use justifiable force because the relative size of the parties, right? So, for example, if I'm a gigantic, muscular UFC fighter, and a gentleman who's 5'5", who weighs 140 pounds, is threatening me, then it's highly unlikely that I'll be able to argue self defense. Highly unlikely, because they would look at the relative size of the parties and say, well, you really didn't need to use force because you're so much larger than that person, and the force that you used was way too much because of your size. So they do take that into account and consideration.
That is fascinating. Okay, so because there's different laws that apply in different states and then there's federal law, are there any differences in this area that people should take into consideration?
Oh yes, and it's not necessarily as topical because it's not about professional fights, but there is hate crime laws, and federal laws are very strict on hate crimes, and that means if you fight someone or attack someone because of some sort of some demographic, right, background. So if I fight someone because that person is a certain religion, or if that person has a certain sexuality, or if that person identifies as transgender, and if that's my motivation, what I mean is, if you just incidentally get into a fight with someone of a certain demographic, that is not a hate crime, but it's very aggravated. So they will take a crime that may have a certain severity level, and if they determine that your motivation was based on race, ethnicity, gender, or any type of demographic, if that's your primary motivation for the attack, then federal law dictates that it's very aggravated, extremely, and you can look at way more severe sanctions.
Okay, so in terms of, I guess from a federal end of things, if you were convicted in that area, what sort of prison time are you looking at roughly?
The maximum for a third-degree felony or a hate crime is 5 years prison. That's the maximum, and generally you don't get the maximum, but put it this way: a regular standard battery, the maximum is 1 year in jail. So it goes from 1 year to 5 years, just based on what I just discussed.
Okay. And so then in relation to the different laws in each state and things like that, like I'm thinking like, there's some YouTubers that I follow, like Molly May, is a celebrity over here and her partner's a fighter and he might be touring all over the US and things like that. If he was to get in a fight, in one state, but then also get in a fight in another state, is there things that people should be aware of that where it might be drastically different in states across the US?
Yes. I wouldn't say drastically different, but significant enough that you need to consider it and worry about it. Some states deal with certain crimes substantially different. Some states have different levels of law enforcement activity, where the prosecutors in this one state might not consider. Like, for example, if you're in a big city like Miami, Florida, or New York City, or Chicago, or Los Angeles, if you're in a major metropolitan city and you commit a low level crime, it may not even be prosecuted because those cities have so many things going on in the criminal justice system that they have to pick and choose, right? So if you're in a small town and you commit even the smallest crime, you can expect to be prosecuted. If you're in a major city, they just don't have the resources. So I've spoken to many criminal defense attorneys in Miami, which is in my state of Florida. And when someone commits a crime in that city, the same crime that someone would commit in my city, I have much more of a challenge because here, since this is a smaller city, that would be considered high priority for them. Whereas in another city, they would say, oh no, we're only worried about murders and kidnappings and very severe cases.
That's fascinating. And it's quite topsy turvy when you think of like US based movies. And, like, for example, if someone's getting in a fist fight in a city bar versus, Dukes of Hazzard, where everyone's just throwing pews around and, like, chairs everywhere. Someone's high kicking someone over there.
Yeah.
Like, and it's actually going, chances are you might be criminally prosecuted more likely in the Dukes of Hazzard situation as opposed to the city, just based on resources.
Yes. And for numerous reasons. Not only is it the resources, because there's not enough judicial resources to handle all of that crime, but also we have what's called, it's a figure of speech, we call it the good old boys system. I don't know if you've ever heard of that, but small towns have sort of people running those cities or towns. It's like a family. Like, think of a powerful family, right, that has been around for a very long time, and sort of that family, if you look at law enforcement, many of the police officers will come from that family, or many of the judges and prosecutors and things of that nature. So the law is skewed a certain way, right? So you can expect things to be more personal. In a major city, you're just a number. They don't know who you are. But in smaller towns, they say, oh, that's Daniel Martinez. Treat him this way or that way. And politics comes into effect. Like, if I didn't treat that family kindly, if I didn't kiss the ring, then they're going to be mad at me and treat me differently than they would otherwise.
Oh, that is so crazy. And it's an absolute minefield. It's complete testament to, this law for the lay thing, and that it's a game that we all don't necessarily know how to play. And there was a quote that I looked up from Mike Tyson that was like, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. And I was like, you'd almost want to hope you're in a state where it's in your favor.
Oh yeah. Yes, that's accurate. And but see, at the end of the day, I think that people need to be mindful of the decisions they make. But I'm happy that you have this show, because people need to understand, even though I'm an attorney, this is going to sound very biased, but it's so important to consult with an attorney no matter what the issue you're dealing with. I always advise, try to find someone who does free consultations so you don't have anything to lose to speak to them. But put it this way, Clarissa, I am an attorney, and I consider myself a very high level attorney. I hope that doesn't sound arrogant, but I'm good at what I do. However, if I was faced with any legal issue, I would not represent myself, because have you ever heard the expression, he who represents himself has a fool for a client? Have you ever heard that?
Yes, I have heard that. Yes. It's very dangerous.
It's very dangerous, and it's just very important to have an unbiased, objective viewpoint, and somebody who has experience, who's not emotional about the issue. Because when we have our own personal issues, there's a certain level of emotion, and we make decisions not necessarily based on logic and evidence and objective facts. So I always recommend, Clarissa, that people consult with an attorney. I hate when people get charged money for consultations, because I firmly believe that someone should have a free consultation to see if I can help them. If I cannot help them, I will not take their money. I will refer them to somebody else. If I can help them, the free consultation will ascertain that. So I don't know if it's common in other countries for there to be free consultations, but I would always advise anybody, whether you're a professional fighter, a regular individual, a business person, a farmer, whatever the case may be, always consult with counsel.
Absolutely. And I completely agree with you. And that was the one thing that I told a lot of, friends, family, and people that I met when they said that they were apprehensive to get legal advice on something. And I said, look, you can call a lawyer and say, am I going to get charged for an initial consultation? They can say yes or no. and then you go from there. And most of the time they'll say, tell me the problem. And then they'll say, look, I think you should come in for a meeting, or I can point you to these resources. And that's important for everyday people to understand, because there are situations where someone just thinks, I can't afford a lawyer and I don't know where to take it from here. So that's very good advice. Thank you, Daniel.
Sometimes people won't consult with an attorney because they think it might make them look guilty or look like they have something to hide. But I will, since we spoke about stand-up comedy earlier, I will remind people of when Chris Rock, the American comedian who just got slapped by Will Smith, years ago, when O.J. Simpson was charged with his cases, he made a comment about, OJ had all these lawyers, so he looked guilty. But he said, man, it's better to look guilty at the mall than innocent in jail. That's what he said.
Absolutely. You'd want to know that you've gone through a process, justice has been administered, which side of the argument you sit with, OJ. But look, it is certainly always important to get legal advice, particularly in an altercation with battery and things like that, because you just can't adequately represent yourself most of the time. Speaking
of self-defense, I will tell you, I just won a very, very serious jury trial. I don't know if you saw it on my social media, but on Friday, and it was a self-defense this past Friday, and it was a self-defense case where my client he was getting beat up by 8 individuals. He had to pick up a beer bottle and stab somebody with it, basically. That was his only way of escaping. And then he hit somebody with his vehicle. So he was charged with 2 counts of aggravated battery with a deadly weapon, because a vehicle and a beer bottle could be considered a deadly weapon. And he was looking at 30 years of incarceration if convicted. I argued self-defense.
Oh my God.
And he's now home with his family.
Oh, wow. Well done. And look, that's so crazy. I mean, I wouldn't survive a fight like that. Well, I'm so glad I met you, Daniel, for next time I get in a bar altercation. But thank you so much for joining us here on Law for the Lay. And I will make sure that I link your profile so everyone can have a look at the amazing content you put online.
Thank you so much. And thank you for having me. Anytime you need us back or need me back, I'm happy to do it. Okay.
Can't wait. Thanks, Daniel. Bye. Thanks for joining us here at Law for the Lay. If you enjoyed this episode, I'd love for you to swing it around your social circles, and feel free to connect with me on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube at Law for the Lay. I'm always open to your feedback and content suggestions. Please also remember this disclaimer that no Law for the Lay content should be taken as legal advice. This is simply general information intended for educative purposes. Laws change all the time, and your personal circumstances may apply differently to what is discussed. So always do your research and contact a legal professional if you need assistance. In the meantime, look after yourself, look after each other, and let's have a good time.